From Toronto to Tokyo, and from Thonia to Syrinx, this is The Basement, your companion to the Ready Player One novel. Join our hosts each episode for complete chapter breakdowns and deep dives into the pop culture references through a series of challenges and homework assignments. The Basement is the Ready Player One podcast for people who love things. And now, please welcome Albert and the rest of the Gunchers for this week's episode. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the very first bonus stage episode of the Basement Podcast. My name's Albert Padilla, and I'll be your host tonight. This is going to be the films of Richard Donner. So I've kind of teased about this in some of our previous episodes, and this whole concept of having bonus episodes is just something I really wanted to do, and we're going to have more of these coming, specifically when we get to Chapter 6, and from that point on. Time permitting really is kind of the only reason these things haven't come out as frequently or as often as I wanted them. So, but joining me tonight is a fellow Goonie, fellow Gunter. He's a true lover of Oingo Boingo and Toto. Please welcome back to the show, Bill Alwine.
Hello,
Mr.
hello.
Alwine? Yeah, welcome back. We missed you.
It's good to be back. I appreciate you inviting me back for my third appearance.
I know. You've now been on more times than any other host in the history of this show. So that's all, 9 episodes.
Well, I feel very special. Thanks.
And really, we haven't done a show together in well over a month, but for the listeners, because we recorded the episode 5 on June 12th, we actually recorded that before I even did, we recorded that before I recorded episode 4. So for anyone listening, you probably have no clue that there's been that much time that's lapsed, but it's been quite a while since we've gotten together on the microphone. So
yeah, it definitely has.
Yeah. So tonight we're going to do just kind of the films of Richard Donner, and we're not really going to do all of the films. I'm specifically targeting the films that are at least mentioned early on in the Ready Player One novel. So we're going to be looking at Superman, Superman 2, Ladyhawke, and then we'll kind of close with the Goonies. We're not going to do news segments when we do the bonus stages. They're kind of meant to be their own standalone kind of episodes. So with that, we'll kind of just jump into it. And we're going to start with Superman, released in 1978. This movie was produced by Ilyas Salkind and Alexander Salkind, along with Pierre Spengler. Now, these names probably don't mean a whole lot to you. If you're a huge Superman fan, you probably have some very strong opinions one way or the other when it comes to these producers. And they're going to play a huge role later on when we get to what we call the Richard Donner cut with Superman 2. But initially, they had, were looking for a director to do this, and they had sought out Richard Donner because he had just kind of come off of doing The Omen. And in addition to them, they were looking at people like George Lucas, who was kind of tied up in this new movie called Star Wars, which we now know was a huge flop, right? I mean, that movie didn't do anything. Spielberg, they were actually waiting on to see how Jaws was going to do. And based on that, they were going to maybe offer or approach him. But he got tied up in another movie, again, a flop called Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So he wasn't available. So they ended up going with Richard Donner. So were you aware that these guys were actually pegged? And is that a surprise for you, given how popular both of those guys were in the late 70s to, early 80s?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you really wouldn't have known.
Yeah. I mean, they don't make and again, this is before the internet. Today, we probably get all kinds of news leaks and everything else about who's being considered. But back then, there was really probably no way that we knew. The screenplay was Mario Puzo, and, he's known for doing The Godfather. But, in some of these drafts, and honestly, we could probably do a whole show just on Superman because there's so much drama around it and that was happening with production. And it's really all over the place. The most offensive, I guess, or most severe story that I heard about the original screenplay was that Kojak, the character of Kojak, played by Telly Savalas, was supposed to be in the movie. Freaking Kojak was supposed to be a character in the Superman movie. Thankfully that never happened. But in terms of the script, there's a lot of stuff here that's kind of, I would say, ridiculous and borderlines. We're going to get into a lot of that here. real quick. But some of the other interesting things about the original Superman movie were who they were considering at one point to be cast for these different roles. I think the most interesting for Lex Luthor was Dustin Hoffman. Can you see Dustin Hoffman playing Lex Luthor?
I really can't. But to tell you the truth, I'm not sure I would have seen Gene Hackman either.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. And then it's one of those things where when you actually, now that we've seen Hackman, it's kind of hard, at least for me, especially since this was the Superman series that I grew up with. It's hard for me to disconnect the two. He will always be Lex Luthor, among other roles. Don't get me wrong. He went on to have obviously very successful and fruitful career.
Sure.
But it's hard to separate those or divorce those in my mind, anyways, at this point. For Superman, so Robert Redford was considered at one point.
Interesting.
Burt Reynolds. Burt Reynolds was another. He was in, not to pull Star Wars, because we're going to make several Star Wars references here throughout the show tonight. But Burt Reynolds was one of those guys that was he's known for having been considered for the Han Solo role at one point too. So yeah, remember at this time, this is Smokey and the Bandit, Cannonball Run. He was doing a lot of really, I won't say fine work, but popular work at the time. So
Right.
he was heavily sought out there. Paul Newman was considered for Superman at one point. I think Paul Newman actually was considered for a couple different roles. What's his name? Schwarzenegger, right? So this is how crazy this got. Schwarzenegger was actually considered at one point. Neil Diamond was considered in the role of Superman. I mean, this list goes on and on and on.
I definitely would have watched Neil Diamond. That would have been great.
Right? Yeah. Oh boy, that would have been an interesting movie to say the least. And in Reeve, actually, Christopher Reeve was actually, he auditioned for the role, and I think they kind of looked at him and said, "Hey, you're a little too scrawny." Initially, when they were just kind of looking at his portraits or whatever, he came in, knocked their socks off with his audition, and they kind of gave him the feedback that he was a little too light. And so when he got cast as the role, they were going to pad his suit, and he didn't want to do that. So he actually went out and sought Mr. Prose. So David Prose, who plays Darth Vader in the Star Wars movies. And so this guy, his background was he was a weightlifter and, known for his physique and all that. And that's kind of what, he was super tall. That's why he got that role. But he actually trained on him and added some weight so that he could. So when you see Superman back in 1978, that is actually Christopher Reeve. There's no padding. There's nothing that's been done. He did his best to buff up for the role. So I thought that was all pretty interesting stuff in terms of who was being considered at least one point for all these roles. But let's get into the movie itself. And I'm just going to throw it out to you initially. But so as a kid, was this something that you saw on the drive-in, the theater? Were you a big Superman fan, running around, jumping off couches and all of that? Or when did you get pulled into this particular movie?
Yeah, very early on. I can't remember if I did see this in the theater or not, but I guess I must have, since, at the time, VHS wasn't really a common thing yet.
No.
I definitely remember seeing it on network television in the 80s, and it's such a cool movie. It had a really big impact on me. I had a red towel that I wore around my neck for probably a good year, maybe a year and a half.
Right.
Which is, I think, probably pretty common around young boys that were of that age at that time.
Yeah, even today. This character's so iconic there that you throw on a cape and, we'll get to the theme song in a minute, but that's pretty, that just kind of falls in line, right?
Totally.
You run around with your arm in the air, fist clenched, and acting like Superman. I don't remember seeing this movie in the theater. It was well before I even got to the theaters. This had to have been a drive-in viewing for me if I saw it younger. I do remember seeing this a lot on television, and there are a lot of versions of it. We're not going to get into it in this show because it kind of goes beyond the scope of what we're trying to do here.
Right.
But there are a lot of different TV-made versions that came out both here in the U.S. and then internationally. And it's interesting because they've added, for a lot of these releases, they added footage, they removed footage. There was some to make things longer, to make things shorter, and that kind of thing. But I do remember this being on television a lot.
Yes.
And it was a big deal, right? They would advertise this weeks in advance that Superman was coming on ABC or whatever channel it was going to be shown on. But going back and thinking about the movie just from the beginning, one of the things that really stood out to me was the opening credits.
Uh-huh.
Like even today, apart from like Star Wars, I can't really think of many movies where I think, wow, those credits are awesome. it was very captivating in terms of how the swoosh of the names would come in, and it was all synced to this glorious music that was composed by John Williams. And you kind of got this, it was kind of setting the stage that this was more than just Earth, right? And for me as a kid, I really wasn't into the mythos. I just knew Superman was a cool character on Earth, but he kind of sets this tone for you that we're going into the cosmic, we're going into space, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that this was going to be something different.
Yeah, absolutely. And it almost frames the mindset of we're flying too, which becomes a theme and a tagline that we'll talk about a little bit later for this movie in 1978, because the special effects. I mean, you can almost say that this movie hinged on whether or not the suspension of disbelief was there when it came to somebody being able to fly and all of that. But this was a huge craze. I had the lunchbox, right? The Superman mania was going rampant in circa 79, 80 especially. I remember the Topps trading cards.
Oh yeah.
Everybody had those, and this is like almost, well, I don't know if, I'm not a big card collecting person, but for me at least, I know in the late 70s this was the thing. Early 80s this was the thing. Trading cards were huge, not only just baseball cards, but all of like the Star Wars cards and this one, and all those other movies that were kind of coming out there had their own card sets. And so that was a big one. This is also around the same time that we had t-shirt iron-ons. Everybody was making and they were putting them in cereal boxes, and you could go buy them over at the Ben Franklin store for a nickel, and you'd go buy your shirt and throw them on. And there was just no end to the number of Superman iron-ons that you could buy just with that, iconic emblem. So it was kind of a whole kind of craze, in terms of merchandising. There was just no end to what was going on here with Superman 1. And then it just kind of went completely nuts in 80 when Superman 2 came out. But did you have anything else that you collected or anything that you picked up that had Superman on it?
I'm sure that I did. I can't remember anything specific. The lunchbox sounds familiar, but I had so many lunchboxes, from G.I. Joe to all the different stuff from back in the 80s. I'm sure Superman was in there somewhere.
Yeah. Not to jump ahead, I think one of the other things that really, so apart from, and we'll talk about this in a minute, the 2600 game, the Atari 2600 Superman game, that was a big one. But I definitely remember, now I think about this, I kind of want to go out to eBay and see with it, but there was a Superman 2 board game that me and my sister, who's 3 years younger, would play quite a bit, right, probably about 81, 82. And I can't tell you the number of blood drawing fights we had playing that game. And so if she's listening, she's probably going to get a laugh from that, because that was, it was like the only board game we had too. And one summer we were cooped up, and that was all we did. And I don't know that our relationship ever healed from that. But it was a fun game. So maybe I'll go back and kind of look for that.
I bet you'd get a kick out of that.
Yeah. Let's talk about the characters. So I guess first impressions of Christopher Reeve in this role of Superman.
I mean, just as what you mentioned earlier, he's still the standard to which I hold all other Supermen. His Clark Kent.
That's a good way. Yeah, good point.
His Clark Kent is funny, awkward. He has just enough Superman kind of showing through to still respect him as a man, right?
Yeah.
But his Superman is all that we think that a Superman ought to be. Plus, he's funny. He's got this wink in his eye,
Yeah.
And looking back on it now, we talked about Gene Hackman a little bit. He seems a little unlikely at the time, given how he's portrayed in the comics.
Yeah.
But I guess the film just needed some star power. But yeah, he absolutely killed it. He's so cool, but he's so angry at the same time. He's a great compliment to Reeves as Superman.
And just as a side note, looking back on, there's some articles that have been written about their pay rate. So Marlon Brando got the most money. I mean, to the tune of like, I don't know, $6 million or something like that. And this is circa 78. Gene Hackman was pulling like 3 million, 3.5, somewhere around there. And then the next highest paying star for this movie was Christopher Reeve, who was getting who got $250,000 for both movies.
Wow.
And he's that guy is amazing. He's just an amazing guy off camera, right? I mean, we won't, again, beyond the scope of what we're trying to do tonight, but he's on record as saying, hey, you know what? Even though I got $250,000, Superman 1, Superman 2 opened my career up to a lot of things, and he was just grateful for that. So, super humble guy, but I thought he did an amazing job. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there with, he is the standard, right? Every Superman that comes out at least in our generation, our lifetime, is going to be held against that performance by Christopher Reeve. I thought Margot Kidder did a good job in her role. It's unfortunate she really didn't do, I guess, a whole lot more. She didn't, obviously do any more big blockbuster movies, but in these particular movies, I think this is some of her best work. Now, you could argue there's other movies she did prior to that were mid 70s, that kind of thing, that were better overall. But I thought she was great as Lois Lane, except when she was smoking in Superman 2, but we'll come back to that in a minute. Marlon Brando, coming off the Godfather movies and all that, I think he was fine, right? I don't even know that it had to be him since his role was such a small role. But yeah, it was cool that they got him. And then Gene Hackman, who, a huge fan of Gene Hackman, mostly because of Hoosiers. But I always thought he was great as Lex Luthor. Again, as a kid, I didn't know any better. I had really nothing to compare him to. But I know I liked him, and I thought he was funny. He has moments. His comedic timing, I think, is great.
It's really
just
good.
About everything it is. And then the other guy that we don't talk about a lot is Ned Beatty.
Ned Beatty, that's right. Yeah. Who does an amazing job. So funny.
He does an amazing job as this bumbling idiot Otis, right, throughout all the movies. And it's funny because he actually won, or he was nominated for Best Supporting Actor in 1976 for a movie called Network.
That's right.
And honestly, I've never seen this movie. I went out and just watched some of the scenes that he's in. It's like, it blows you away. Like he was totally deserving of the nomination, and arguably he probably should have won it. As a result of kind of doing some research here, I actually want to go back now and watch that. But anyways, he was good as Otis, and he was like the comic relief for sure, right? In this movie.
That's right.
And the whole movie was kind of campy, I guess. And we'll table that because I want to come back to that in a minute here.
That's debatable. I mean, you can compare him to the other Superman movies,
and this one's pretty tame.
Right.
Granted for sure. One other kind of interesting note: teenage Kent. So this is in the flashback scenes where he's in, or I guess they're flashback scenes, but in the scenes leading up to him actually becoming, Superman. And he's living in Smallville. He's going to high school. The actor was Jeff East. And I didn't know this, but it sounds like his lines were dubbed, right? They brought in Christopher Reeve. He recorded all of his lines, did his scenes the way, what was expected of him. And then he didn't even know this. He didn't know they were going to come back in, record Christopher Reeve saying all these lines, and then dubbing those right over his own.
Wow, I didn't know that. Track. That's amazing.
And honestly, it never clicked. And I thought, no way. And when I went back and watched the movie, sure enough, it sounds exactly like him.
Huh.
And they went through a couple of painstaking things to add more makeup to him to kind of give him the look of Christopher Reeve, really. So when you see his character, like his actor profiles back then, and what you see on screen, they look a little bit different. So it's he almost kind of, I can't say this with any certainty because I didn't really do a whole lot of research on Jeff East, and I honestly can't remember anything else he's done since this movie. But it's got to make you wonder that, because they did all that to kind of make him look like Christopher Reeve, whether or not he actually got any more work, or if he did, if he would even be recognizable in that other work. So any other kind of, I guess, initial or final thoughts on the characters or the actors themselves?
The only other one that we didn't talk about that has even a smaller part would have been Miss Tessmacher.
Miss Tessmacher!
who, I mean, at the time, just, I don't know, she could have been any old lady, but I thought she did a fantastic job in that role as well. It was a great, another comic relief part. Yeah.
And it wasn't until later in life that I started to have kind of feelings for her character. She was cute.
Yeah.
Not as a kid, though. That was
no.
Creepy.
That's what I meant. As a kid, she was an old lady.
She's an old lady. Now you look at her, she's like, she's a pretty attractive woman.
Like, really? Lois Lane? That's who you went for? All right.
Hey, man, whatever. So let's talk about the music. So here we go. We got John Williams, right? And this is like the Triple Crown, because in the same year, within a span of about a year, this guy cranks out the Star Wars, Close Encounters of the Third Kind soundtrack and the Superman soundtrack. Now, each one of those in its own are just amazing soundtracks. They're super iconic. They're easily recognizable, and this is just, par for course for John Williams. He's I'm kind of boasting about him because he is my favorite composer, as probably most people are, for most people as well. But he just, in the span of 1 year, cranks out these 3 amazing scores. In this particular one, the Superman theme, there's a lot of great moments in there, and I have a really hard time deciding on which one I like best. And so the three that really stand out to me are the prelude, and then there's the main theme, which we're all kind of probably familiar with. That's the one you say whenever you're running around acting like Superman. Bum ba-dun, dun, 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 dun,
Yeah,
right? That's
exactly.
that's probably the biggest one. But the one that for me as a kid, and it was very subtle, and it didn't even really hit me until later on in life, like way later on in life. But there's a song called, or a track called "The Planet Krypton," and that was used in the Superman Returns trailer. Superman Returns, I think, was 2006, somewhere around there. But between those three, do you have a particular one, or I guess overall, I guess when looking at the soundtrack, where would you rank this? Even if you had to rank it against other John Williams scores, or even against these three, if you could pick between Close Encounters, Star Wars, and Superman, which would you go with?
Oh, Superman, definitely. I think that was some of his absolute best work. But I'm not sure he's really ever done any bad work. I mean, if you can still recall and sing in your own head that orchestral score to a movie, I'd say it's pretty fantastic stuff.
Yeah, and honestly, I don't even know that I could pick which one I like more. Well, no, I say that Star Wars is probably my favorite for other reasons, but this is one of those ones where, again, there's just so many great tracks in them, and so many great pieces. Now you brought this up, and I thought we could just go there because "Can You Read My Mind?" So this is an interesting song, I guess, in the movie. It's one of and when we get to it, we're going to talk about some of our favorite scenes, maybe least favorite scenes. This scene as a kid didn't really I didn't connect with it, right? And it was always weird because it was all in her head. Can you read my mind? And that kind of thing. And for the longest time, I wondered what was really going on there. It just seemed like it was out of place. Well, the backstory here is that originally Margot Kidder was supposed to sing that song. The lyrics that the lines that you hear that are in her head while they're flying together in that really romantic, mystical, magical moment, that was supposed to be her actually singing the song. Now, back then, probably wasn't weird for a movie, right?
Right.
Now, I don't know that anybody would ever take the chance to do something like that. And it's interesting because that song actually did get released in 1979. So it was performed by Maureen McGovern, and it got to number 3 in the Billboard charts. If you go out to iTunes, YouTube, anywhere, and look up "Can You Read My Mind" and Maureen McGovern, you can actually hear the song. It's John Williams music. It's actually just an actual song that someone sang.
Got singing on top of it.
Yeah, got singing on top of it. So interesting little, I guess, piece of trivia there. But that scene was, I don't know, I think as a kid, I was just kind of like, ew, gross, right?
Yeah, it's
He's already talking about her panties. And,
yeah. Well,
right?
Well, that part was kind of cool, but
I don't know. Not for me. I was, you were a little bit older, I think, but yeah, it was already kind of gross. It's like, okay, yeah, let's get on with the action. I want to see more bad guys and kind of thing. But
yeah, and the scene lasts forever. They're flying
really
around that city forever.
Really
yeah.
Well, let's do that. Let's get into some of our, I guess, favorite scenes and memorable quotes. What do you got queued up? Anything that you want to kind of dive into or talk about?
So my favorite scenes of the movie, when Superman gets hit over the head with a lead pipe.
Yep.
And it's yes, that's the one. Also a great quote there.
Yep.
Lois's car falling into the crack.
Yeah, at the very end after the earthquake from the bomb.
The dam breaking.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the earth spinning backwards was like, holy cow, what is happening? That was,
right.
I mean, is there any end to Superman's powers?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those are all great moments. If the destruction of Krypton creeped me out as a kid. I guess just seeing that many people die at age 5 or 6 years old was a little shocking, but it hardened me. So I'm happy for that. I thought Space Baby was cool when the baby's flying through space and aging, and you got Marlon Brando's voiceover. That was a pretty cool little cinema moment. The one that I remember, from trailers and anytime it was promoted on television was little Clark Kent or little, Kal raising up the truck, standing there, and he's naked and he's holding up the truck for Mr. Kent there after he had the flat tire. That was always a one that stood out. The kicking of the football, right when he kicks it in high school and it just goes wherever.
Or racing the train.
Yeah, racing the train. Oh, that even as a kid, I always thought that looks kind of weird the way he's running.
Yeah.
Right? He looks like he was on a treadmill or suspended in midair to make
It didn't look quite right, but it was still cool.
And that was a cool little Easter egg there too. The little girl on the train would be Lois Lane, right? Well, I don't know if they really say that, but the mom says, "Hey, something about hey Lois or whatever,
right.
Pay attention or whatever." So that's kind of nice little Easter egg there. The whole helicopter scene was just great moment for me. And I could go on and on, right? There's the airliner scene where he's like, just fly, right? When he Superman gets in there and picks up the wing. But I think so. If I had to give a final answer, this is going to sound, and I'm not kidding you. Okay, so as a kid, the one line that I always thought was the coolest line and the coolest moment was just before. It was probably the whole piece of the helicopter falling down and you got me, who's got you, that kind of thing. I know what you're
going to say, but go ahead.
But before that, leading up to that, you have Clark Kent who's out there. He's looking around. He knows he's got to change. He looks over. He sees a phone booth. And the phone booth is now, back in the 50s, 60s, even earlier, the phone booths were kind of actual booths. And at this point, a lot of them were kind of going into these half booths. And so he realizes, oh, crap, I can't change here. So he ends up going into a hotel and they cut over to this pimp, right?
That's right.
There's a pimp that's standing there and he comes out of there and he says, "Say, Jim, woo," right? He says, "That's a bad outfit." And then Superman looks over to him as a polite gentleman says, "Excuse me," right? And then he flies off into the air. And the last thing you hear is, "Woo," right? And that guy is Bo Rucker is the name of the actor.
Okay.
And it's funny because I was like, okay, I wonder if he's ever done anything. He had other movie roles that he did. It was pretty light. I found a really cool interview. There's nothing really too, I don't know, standoutish about the interview. He seems like a pretty kind of humble guy and all of that. But I wonder if how many other fans of him in that particular scene of the Super Pimp that are out there. I wonder if he really knew just how many folks that really appealed to. But I always thought that was just a really cool moment that, the pimp noticed Superman's outfit and was like, heck yeah, I want that too.
Right.
So.
He doesn't care that he can fly or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly.
He just likes
what he's
wearing.
That's a bad outfit. Yeah. That was a great scene. And then I guess the only other one that we probably should mention is the very, very end of the movie when Superman is flying off. And right before we get the credits, we get him. You get the sunset or the sunrise, the sunrise, I guess, coming over the horizon of the Earth. You see Superman, he flies towards it, and then on the next shot, he's coming back, and he kind of he breaks that third barrier, right? He looks at the camera, and he kind of gives you that smile, that one you were talking about. That was as a kid, I remember that guy. He smiled at me, right? He looked at me, he smiled at me, and it became they would do that in Superman 2, Superman 3, and even in Superman 4, Quest for Peace or whatever that garbage was. Every one of the movies ended in that same manner of him kind of winking, and then we got it again as a throwback, as a tribute to all of that with Richard Donner in 2006 with Superman Returns. I don't remember if the new one, Man of Steel, or even Justice League had that scene. I don't think
so. I think they really tried to break away as much as they could from the old ones.
No, that's fair. So I got to ask you: did the scream at the very end scare you as a kid when Lois Lane dies and he decides he's going to go back in time or reverse time?
Definitely. I mean, not like nightmare scared, but it was so powerful and you really felt for him. I mean, for somebody like Superman to be that hurt, even emotionally, that was scary. Yeah.
Yeah. It terrified me. That whole scene did, because there was already an earthquake, right? So I was scared of water towers at this age. I distinctly remember that, thinking that thing's going to blow up and we're all dead. It's going to be Noah's Ark all over again.
Yeah.
But that particular scene scared me, and even the way it was filmed, because it's a series of 3 transitions where they're kind of fading at different angles, and we don't know how much time has lapsed. He's sitting there with, Lois dead, and then he kisses her, which I'm thinking as a kid, what's that all about? Kissing dead people, right?
Right.
But then, and then it just it starts escalating, and he's kind of shaking his head, and you kind of start hearing this whisper of no, 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 and then next thing you know, he just lunges at the screen, screaming at the top of his lungs, and I'm like, well, that's it, Mom, take me out. I want to go home. This
funny.
is too much for me. But yeah, that scene scared the crap out of me as a
Yeah, a
kid.
little disturbing.
All right, so the tagline of Superman, the original Superman, was "You'll believe a man can fly." So I'll just pose that question to you: do you think they did enough with this movie that, again, back in 1978, with the special effects and the practical effects that they had, do you feel like the audience felt like, hey, he actually was flying?
That's a tough question to answer. I mean, I was pretty young at the time. He certainly looked like he was flying to me.
Yeah, right.
However, I mean, looking back at it and seeing where the technology is these days, it's really hard to really suspend your disbelief anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't look like he was on wires. It didn't look like he was being flung around from a catapult or anything like that. I think he sold it.
And they did do some pretty good practical effects. I mean, they had some very limited blue screen stuff that they did with this movie, but for the most part, a lot of it were just practical effects. And so maybe that's, it was painstaking, and in terms of how they had to deliver this stuff. But I think in the end, it paid off. And again, sign of the times, it probably did. It did. I think it as a kid. Yeah, I mean, Superman was totally flying.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the special effects again. You're right; they probably don't hold up really well. But there's so much there in the movie and the performance and the story that you don't even you don't even think about that stuff honestly as you're watching the movie. So
Yeah, and that's okay. I mean, one of the things about these older movies is that if you saw them as a kid, that nostalgia will carry a lot of weight. It can make up for a lot when the movie doesn't age real well. Going back
yeah.
and trying to watch something that you might have missed from the 80s, can be a pretty tough ask.
And then there's one other aspect of the movie, and we're almost to the end here, wrapping at least this one up, and we'll move to Superman 2. But there's one other aspect of this particular movie that'll play a little bit more here in Superman 2. But Superman 1 and 2 were filmed at the same time. The whole idea here was that Richard Donner was going to film both of them, and so he shot a lot of the footage. Up to seven, rumors are, or I guess they're not really rumors. I think the best estimates are about 75% of Superman 2 was filmed before when Superman 1 was released. And the only reason they didn't complete the filming of Superman 2 was because they were running behind on Superman 1. So they just put all the resources into Superman 1, try to get that out before the Christmas holiday. Mm-hmm. And then they would come back to Superman 2. But I bring that up because it was a very interesting approach in how, and we see this later, right? Like Lord of the Rings did this. Peter Jackson did this kind of thing where he was filming a lot of this stuff in tandem. At the same time. But this movie did really kind of change a lot of approaches to the way movies and planned sequels are made. We kind of got some of this in Star Wars where they end up using some of the footage, that kind of thing. But the other aspect of this particular movie that was maybe changing or kind of set the prototype was this idea that superhero films didn't need to be complete campiness, right? There's certain moments in this movie that are very serious. And yeah, it's got its lighter moments, right? Not to the tune of like maybe part 2 or even worse, part 3. But it was a shift, right, in terms of where they felt like these superhero movies needed to go. And today, we've got the Marvel movies that I think do a pretty good job of blending the comedy with the seriousness and the more serious tones and stories. A lot of that stems from the fact that Richard Donner, and you've got a number of directors today that are making movies that are just not only about superheroes, but action movies where this became the prototype. They look back at this and say, hey, this is the movie that inspired me to kind of give it the tone and a feel that I wanted for those movies. So certainly made its mark in terms of that with cinema. All right. So any other final thoughts on the movie before we just really quickly talk about the 2600 game?
Let's talk about the game.
Yeah. So this is one of the first games that I remember. Now, it wasn't a game that I remember playing initially because I didn't have it. But when I actually got around to playing it, I realized it was a really good game. At least for me, I thought it was a great game. So we're talking about the Atari 2600 game, released in 1979 by Atari. It was programmed by, I guess, John Dunn is the primary person who got credit for this one. And you kind of played, you played Superman. It was a single player game. One of the earlier single player games too. A lot of games at that time were released to be 2-player, right? I think it had a single player or a 2-player mode where one person controlled the up and down on one controller, and then the second person would control the left and right. And to me, whoever came up with that idea was nuts. I can't even get someone else to just stay with me on the same screen, much less control half of the character's movement in a game, right? So it was early on. We didn't know any better, but so yeah, you ran around as Superman. You had to capture Lex Luthor, then you had to turn into Clark Kent, and then you had to go back and get to the Daily Planet as quickly as possible, and you were awarded points. And then along the way, you had like kryptonite that was in the way, and if you got hit with kryptonite, you had to go find Lois Lane, who looked just like a bunch of blocks, and give her a kiss, which was always weird. And then you could turn back into Superman. So anyways, that's kind of the premise of the game. But did you play this thing, and how much of a fan were you?
I did play this game. I had no idea how the game worked or what I was supposed to do in it.
As with most Atari games at the time?
Pretty much, yes. So there was a lot of flying around, doing nothing. I don't think I played it for very long. I think I was a little young. I think if I had known exactly what I was supposed to do and figured out how the game worked, that would have been good.
Yeah.
Of course, maybe I was only controlling half the screen.
Right. Someone had the other controller plugged in. You were wondering why you could only go up and down. Right. Yeah. And to be fair, I didn't play this game until I was much older. This game was in 79, and I'm going to guess it had to have been about 83, 84. Well after this movie had been out and the game had been out that I actually got my hands on it. So I was a little bit older, so maybe that was why I picked it up and enjoyed it so much. But it's a cool game. At the time, it was revered for its graphics, which I always think is funny because you look at those old magazines and they write these columns, these writers write these columns, and they just go on and on about how great the graphics are. And I'm like, guys, it's like 8 pixels or blocks. Just you've got one more block than the other guys. So.
You have 6 whole colors instead of 4.
Right. So yeah, it definitely was a game that was popular because of the gameplay, the graphics, and then of course you've got this is one of the earliest tie-ins to like a movie or a big franchise kind of thing that they did on the Atari 2600. So all right, so let's jump to Superman 2. So we kind of set that stage earlier. I mentioned, if you recall, Alexander, Salkind, the Salkind. So they were Alexander and Ilian, or it's not Ilian. I got to get out of the way. Ilya. Ilya was the son. Alexander was the father. So they're the two producers. And then you got Pierre Spengler. Now, by all accounts, these guys were a bunch of douchebags. And sorry, excuse my language, but they were.
Okay.
They weren't really liked. And Richard Donner they were already butting heads with Richard Donner throughout all of the production of Superman 1. When Superman 1 came out and they were on their press tours going around, trying to publicize the movie, Donner had come out and said some things that, they didn't particularly like. There was a lot of contention that had already kind of built up at that point. And so they pretty much got rid of him. Now, again, it wasn't just those two things. There were a lot of things, and because of time, we won't get into it. If you have a chance, go read a lot of this history. It's just the funniest, most saddest things out there in terms of how movies are made. But everything that could possibly go wrong probably happened in Superman 2 at this point. There's plenty of people that were outspoken, like Margot Kidder was outspoken to the fact that Richard Donner was let go. Gene Hackman refused to come back. So they had already shot. Remember, they'd already shot all of that footage for the most part. But when Hackman found out, he was like, forget it. If Donner's not in this, I'm out of here too. So he was gone. You've got, they brought in Richard Lester, who ended up taking over as the director for this movie. And Richard Lester, for all accounts, I guess, was a pretty nice guy. He just was in an awkward situation in that, they ousted this other dude, and now he had to come in and kind of pick up the pieces. And so he had to go reshoot a lot of the footage, or add footage at least, and remove a lot of the footage. Because remember, at this point, 75% of Superman 2 had already been created. So he had to not only get rid of a lot of it, but he had to shoot some new footage in order for him to get the director rights. So I don't know how this thing works, right? There's all these weird rules with who gets credit for writer and producer and all that stuff. But at least at this time, he had to get over like 50%. And so what we ended up getting was a movie that was very different in some areas. But I think overall, the theme was pretty much the same. So all that sets the frame for Superman 2. So we'll talk about the Richard Donner stuff in just a minute. But I guess initial thoughts as a kid, seeing Superman 2 coming off of Superman 1, how much did you like this one? Or I guess how much did you like of this movie?
I liked it more. I think the encounters with Zod and the crew were amazing. It was so much fun seeing his new superpowers. And I mean, whatever happened to those, by the way? What was up with that throwing that logo as a net? I don't know.
Oh yeah, no, it was his cellophane logo,
Yeah.
which they spoofed in Family Guy. I don't know if you get a chance, go YouTube Family Guy Superman cellophane, and there's a scene where it's hilarious
It
where
seems
they
right
kind of make fun of
for
it.
Family Guy, absolutely.
Yeah, no, it's perfect.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I really like this one a lot.
Yeah, I did too, and I'm torn because part of me, I tend to be that guy that seems to be like, oh man, this is the original, this is the way it was supposed to be,
Right.
and then part of me is like, no, I actually really enjoyed this movie,
Yeah.
even as it got a little bit campier. There were moments, and we'll talk about where it really got a little too far for me, even maybe not as a kid. As a kid, I probably just ate this thing up. But now looking back at it, it gets a little cringy,
Yeah.
I guess, if that's a word.
Sure, that's a word.
But yeah, I mean, as a kid, this was, even now, I really enjoyed this movie. And by all accounts, looking at reviews and the ratings, it does well. And a lot of people feel like this is a better movie than the first one. So there's a lot to be said there. I think for me, if we just kind of jump into some of the more memorable scenes and moments, the real big one for me as a kid was the fact that Superman was revealed in this movie. It just was shocking that he gave up his identity, again, as a kid. And how they deal with that later on in the movie, we'll kind of come back to in just a second. But I liked the fact that we got to see the three villains again.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of set them up in the first movie because, again, it was shot at the same time. But that was a really cool thing that they were kind of world building even then, and allowing a lot of the stuff they had laid down in the first movie to come up in the second one. I thought when they get on the moon and they're talking about Planet Houston, right? That was always real cool. I don't think as a kid I really understood that, but as an adult, I'm like, oh, that's cute. They think the actual planet's Houston. But let me pause there before we get too far into it, because I do want to go back and talk about the actors as well. But what are some of the other, what are some of the moments in the movie that stood out for you?
Well, not to jump directly to the end, but for me, nothing beats the scene where he's kneeling before Zod.
Yeah.
And proceeds to just crush the ever-loving crap out of his hand and roll him upside down. Just truly believing that he had lost all his powers, and it being the biggest M. Night Shyamalan twist that a 10-year-old kid had ever seen.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
It was my favorite scene. And of course, my other favorite is the scene in the diner when he has the rematch with the truck driver.
Yeah. I call him Seabass, but I think his name is Rocky.
Yeah. Seabass. That's exactly who it is.
It's Seabass, yeah. The initial Seabass, the original Seabass. Yeah. Both of those were great scenes. So let me ask you then, since you brought that scene up, do you feel like that was in his character to go back? Do you think Superman would be like, you know what, I'm going to rub one in this guy's face and teach him a lesson and go back and trick him into that?
No, yeah. I don't know how I really feel about that as a grown-up, thinking about, okay, maybe Superman has the responsibility to not just go around kicking people's asses.
Especially that young, or that human beings or mere mortals.
Yeah, exactly. He could have.
Yeah, but that guy deserves it. He's a jerk.
He was a jerk.
Jerkwad. Wait, so let's pause there, because there's other scenes and stupid stories I have, but going back to, let's talk about the actors, because we've talked about Reeve, Kidder, Hackman. I think they all did the same, right? Because they were all it was all filmed around that same time.
Right.
But let's talk about Terrence Stamp, or Chancellor Vallorum, as I like to call him from Star Wars. General Zod.
General
right?
Zod.
This was a great character.
Such a great bad guy.
He's awesome.
He almost steals the show for me.
Right. And he's got that iconic line, come to me, son of Jor-El, kneel before Zod. Right. That scene is really cool. We'll get to that in a minute here. But then we had Jack O'Halloran as Non, and he's the non-speaking, grunting bad guy. And then we had Sarah Douglas, who plays Ursa, who I was almost 100% sure was Pat Benatar growing up as a kid.
Right. Same with Zule in Ghostbusters.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. She went on to play Zule in Ghostbusters. But yeah, I thought they all did a really good job. Of course, I don't think I knew any of them prior to that movie.
No.
But yeah, they were great people. There's actually there's one little kind of tidbit. Richard Donner's in this movie. There's a sequence right before, so it's right after he gets powered down, and they're kind of traversing through Alaska, and it's just before they cut into the diner scene. There is a gentleman that's sitting, or I guess he's kind of walking there. And he's got like a pipe. He's smoking a pipe there, and he's wearing this like light colored jacket. That's Richard Donner.
So okay, so just some random extra.
Yeah, just some random extra, right? And then the other person that's in this movie is John Ratzenberger. Now, we skipped over this. Right? He's in everything. He's in Empire Strikes Back. Okay. But so John Ratzenberger is in this movie as he's like one of the NASA guys. So when at the very beginning of the movie, when they're calling Houston and calling in or whatever, there's a scene there, and he's got actually two lines, but his line is, "All right, which one of you guys is using the hair dryer?" Before this, and I'm kind of jumping around here, but in part one, he's in that movie too. He's the air traffic controller guy.
Is he?
Yeah, they show him. He's got a crowd of people behind him, but he's in that movie. So in my mind, my headcanon says that he worked as an air traffic controller, and then he was promoted. He took a job at NASA, and now he's working at Mission Control. So, but yeah, John Ratzenberger, both movies.
I mean, he's got some credits, doesn't he? I think he was in Star Wars too, right?
Yeah, Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah. Wow.
So anyways, all right. So going back to the movie, going back to the favorite scenes, we talked about that one. Oh, so I got a bone to pick, and it's about the stupid scene where they land, and I think they're supposed to be in Houston. I think Houston, Texas. And they walk into the country bar.
Right.
And could you get more stereotypical here, right? And especially I want to give a shout out to the dude wearing the Coors beer shirt. Mm-hmm. He's got the black suspenders on. And he's got I don't know, I guess it's supposed to be a Texas look. But that one is a standout for me. But that whole scene where, she's, let's hold hands. And then she, throws the dude down on an arm wrestling contest kind of thing. That scene stood out. And by the way, the song that's playing in the background of that scene is also the same song that's playing in the background of the Alaska bar scene. And I'm going to draw a blank now on the stupid song. I'll come back to it in a minute, but that particular song.
Was this done on purpose?
Yeah, no, it was. And there's a reason why, because John Williams didn't come back for the song, didn't come back for the soundtrack.
Okay. So they had to replace him.
So they had to replace him. So they ended up going with different pieces of music. And so for that one, they went more with that jazzier kind of song. I'm drawing a blank right now. It'll come to me. But yeah, that was another one that stood out. That whole scene, both of those, the diner scenes were pretty good. Let's talk about the advertisements though. So this is one of those first movies where, like, Philip Morris had reported to have paid $43,000 to have their Marlboro logo in this. It's 22 times that you see the Marlboro logo in this movie. But they weren't the only ones. I mean, Kentucky Fried Chicken, there's a scene in there where they show that logo. Do you remember this thing standing out for you, or like these advertisements?
No.
Well, here's why
it totally flew over my head as a kid. I mean, in hindsight, movies were weird back then, huh? I guess they're just much more subtle now, maybe?
Yeah. I don't know. Maybe they are. I think it's because Dad was smoking cigarettes probably at this time.
Okay.
So when I saw it, the one scene that I definitely remember the logo is in the fight scene in Metropolis between Superman and the villains. And I forget if it's Zod or Non. I think it's Zod or maybe it's Non. He takes him and throws him into the truck.
Yeah.
The Marlboro truck, I guess, the 18-wheeler truck that's hauling cigarettes. That's the only reason that, I even recall it. The KFC one never stood out to me. It's only because I was going back and watching this movie recently that I realized that there are other advertisements in here. The most offensive one is probably the Coca-Cola sign that I think it's Zod gets thrown into.
Right.
He flings him into the air and he goes crashing through the Coke symbol. But this wasn't really the only movie. Even the movie we mentioned earlier, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that had a number of McDonald's. There's one particular scene where one of the spaceships kind of flies up to the billboard and just highlights whatever burger that McDonald's was trying to, pimp at that time. So, but anyways, this is the point of that was really that this is a movie where, we started getting some of this like advertising type stuff that was happening. in movies. What about the scene in like the White House, right, where they come crashing in? That was always, I don't know. As a kid, it was cool. I look back, it was really campy because at one point you see they've set up the sandbag bunker in the White House, and the he's got a bazooka on his shoulder. Right. And when they all land, he doesn't fire the bazooka immediately, right? So there's an exchange. They're kind of, I don't know. They're shooting at him with pistols and M16s and everything else. And he's like lining up his shot. And he's only like 20, 30 feet away at most.
Right.
From General Zod, or I think it's Non who he ends up shooting with. But the funny thing is he's sitting there waiting to fire this bazooka, and he only fires after the guy next to him gives him the tap on the helmet to say you're clear kind of thing, and then he fires the bazooka and it blows up and harmlessly. But it's just those are great scenes. The Rushmore scene where Zod resurfaces where did he learn to do that?
Yeah, I don't know.
They've only been on Earth for a couple hours, maybe, right? A day at most, and he's going around using his eye lasers.
I'm sure it happened off camera sometime.
Yeah, maybe. So let me talk about the other, I guess the one offensive one that I thought was a little too campy.
Okay.
And it's a scene where they're fighting again, which, by the way, overall, that's an amazing scene. For me, it's probably the standout, and I'll come to in a second my favorite scene overall. But that whole fight in Metropolis, I think, is amazing. But there's one point where he's blowing his breath, and suddenly everything is getting blown, and so you got the person on the roller skates, and he's or she, I forget now if it's a guy or a girl. I think it's a guy. He's trying to roller skate and he can't. He continues to try to roller skate. There's a little bit where there's somebody holding an ice cream. Now, mind you, everything's blowing up around him. The whole city's crumbling.
Right.
These guys out here eating ice cream, and the ice cream flies off the cone, hits the other guy in the face, and the toupee falls off. And then you've got the guy in the phone booth who doesn't want to hang up, right? And so the whole phone booth comes crashing, and he's still yet on the ground, still trying to carry on his conversation. That's the stuff that I think, looking back, it started to get a little too campy. And a lot of this is coming from, Lester and the other producers, right? Salkinds. The Salkinds were really wanting to do something that was a little bit more wacky kind of comedy thing. But did any of that stuff stand out to you as a kid?
It didn't at the time. It's just part of the movie. But it's certainly now. I would have a hard time watching that movie.
There's, so I guess my overall favorite scene, and we've already kind of talked about it, was the one where Superman, he gets all his powers stripped of him, and then he gets them back, and we don't really get to see anything. We know that he gets them back, and it cuts over to Metropolis, and it starts with the papers rustling, like the wind is blowing because he just flew by. Those Daily Planet papers are rolling by. Right. And then he kind of perches himself on that flagpole, and he says that line, General, would you care to step outside? And again, it's just that Boy Scout kind of mentality where he's being very polite. Right. Let's take this outside as men kind of thing, fisticuffs thing. And then there's the scene, right? And as soon as he says that, it cuts over to Gene Hackman, who's been given grief by these guys this whole time. And he says, Superman, thank God. I mean, get him, right? He's right. Happy that he's finally going to be removed of these three idiots that he's teamed up with. And that's when we get the famous line of "Come to me, son of Jor-El, kneel before Zod."
Right.
I guess anything else in terms of, well, let me go back to the campiness. Do you feel like it took away or undermined the integrity of the film?
I think the campiness almost always does, depending on who the target audience is. But in this case, this is a sequel, and unless they were really targeting this for kids, I think the campiness does take away from it.
Mm.
I think it's hard enough to take. I mean, you're trying to suspend your disbelief here that you got a superhero that's flying around, and then you've got things like ice cream cones flying in people's faces. To me, it undermines the message of the movie.
Yeah, I think it can too. But again, I'll go back to what I said. Overall, I really enjoyed this movie.
Yeah, it's great. It's one of my favorites.
It's a great movie. And again, if we hadn't had this movie, I would have never had a chance to ruin my relationship with my sister.
That's right.
That board game would have never come out. All right, so Superman 1 or Superman 2, final answer. Which one do you think was a better film?
That's a tough one. I mean, there's so much to like about both of them. At the time, Superman 2 was definitely my favorite. Yeah,
that was
I'm going to stick with Superman 2.
I'm going to go with Superman 1. even as much as I kind of talked about part two and all of that, there's just something special about that first one. So, but it's a pretty close, it's very close.
It is.
I'll just leave it at that. So, we're not going to get too much into the Richard Donner cut. I just want to touch on it on a couple things here. So this was a cut that it was released in 2006. It came out on DVD, Blu-ray, that kind of thing. Not that I was aware of. I don't remember ever being released in film or in theater. But the long story short is, years later, there was kind of almost an internet writing campaign that went out to try to get, everyone was well aware at this point that Donner had shot a lot of footage and the movie had changed a little bit in terms of some of the specifics and what occurred in the movies. Now, overall, like I said, the movie was pretty much the same, right? It had a lot of the same beats and none of the major plot lines were really changed. But there were some key differences. So primarily Marlon Brando. So when he was actually removed from the film because they were trying to save money. If he was going to come back in part two, there was a huge amount of money and cost there in using his face for that movie. So they got rid of him. And in that scene where he's back in the Fortress of Solitude, they brought in his mom. And, she was a lot cheaper than having Marlon Brando's likeness
right.
and using that. So that was one of the changes there. In that same scene, Marlon Brando's character as Jor-El, he actually is the one that gives Superman his powers. It's not that he has the crystal and he finds that, and I guess he, starts another Fortress of Solitude. He actually imbues Superman with the last of whatever power he has to give him back his power. So that whole thing about him falling in love with Lois Lane and, losing his powers was still originally in Richard Donner's vision of the movie. The three villains at the very beginning in the movie that we've just been talking about in the original theatrical release, there is a elevator that is, it's got a bomb on it. Superman rushes it to the top, blows out the top, and then hurls that into space. And it's that explosion that releases the three villains from the negative zone. Well, in the original, or I guess in Richard Donner's vision, it actually is the missile from the first movie. So he has that nuclear missile that he kind of takes out into space and he lets go. Yeah. That missile hurls through space for some, whatever amount of time, right. Eventually catches up with the three villains, blows up, and that's how they're released. Yes. The other, another interesting one was the way Superman was revealed. So in Richard Donner's cut originally, Lois Lane was like all over the fact that, she was convinced Clark Kent was Superman, and from the beginning. And when they get to Niagara Falls, she actually pulls out a gun.
What?
And she pulls out a gun and basically tells them, "Hey, she's gonna fire the gun because she's convinced that to prove it, right?" And she does, and that's kind of how he reveals himself. He takes his glasses off and he's like, "Hey, you could have killed me, but what if you would have been wrong?" That kind of thing. And that particular scene was actually some of the footage that was shot between them two in their testing. So it was like way back when all of this kind of really started. That was one of the first scenes they had ever shot for those two. Non doesn't make all those grunty noises in the original. He's a little bit more menacing. He's not like the bumbling kind of making that stuff. That was all added in there for comic relief.
He's very puppy dog like.
Yeah, definitely. And then in that, and I think it's this particular scene we talked about where I think Zod gets thrown into the Coca-Cola thing. Well, there was one part, and I don't remember who comes in with the flying kick, but somebody hits Superman and sends him into the Statue of Liberty, the torch. And so that footage is out there. You can go see it where he's kind of hurling, after being kicked, and he goes crashing through the torch of the Statue of Liberty, and there's an explosion. I guess there's flame, there's gas or fuel in there. I don't know where that came from, but yeah. So there's little minor things like that, and for the most part, that's really it. I mean, there's other little things. I guess probably the most notable. The only other thing I think is most notable is the very, very end when Ursa, or I guess Lois Lane, realizes that they've lost their powers, and she turns around. And she goes, "You know what? You're a real pain in the neck," and she punches her. That's one of those crowd cheering moments when it happens. If you look at the original theatrical cut, Superman almost smiles like, "Yeah, get her, Lois," that kind of thing. In the Richard Donner cut, he actually looks at her like, "No, that probably wasn't the right thing to do." So again, it's more of, he's more of like more morally centered than being caught up in the emotion of the fact that Lois Lane got some vengeance on the other girl in the movie.
Right.
So, yeah, so that's kind of it. The movie was released. It's out there. It's a little rough. I don't know. I won't say that I like this version better than the theatrical version. In fact, I know I don't. But I think both of them are pretty good. It is a different approach, and there's more. I think Richard Donner was trying to do more with some of the mythos and the relationship stuff,
Right.
where I think the original theatrical release was really going for the action, the comedy elements, and that kind of thing. So, all right. So, final thoughts here on, I guess, the Superman movies.
I haven't seen the Donner cut. I would be interested to see for myself what those changes are, and it would have been interesting to see what his vision would have been for the rest of the series.
Yeah, and there's actually you say that he's on record, and there's a couple of interviews out there where he had a longer term vision with 3 and 4. He doesn't really make any that I found any comments about what that would look like. He just speaks to the fact that, hey, had I been given the chance, I really could have done something special with the whole series of movies, and that's kind of where it leaves off. But it does sound like he had a longer term kind of vision in mind beyond just part 1 and part 2.
Right. It started to go off the rails here after Superman 2.
So let's
move on.
Yeah, let's get into Ladyhawke. All right, so I'm just going to open this up. Ladyhawke, where does this movie fit in with you, I guess, in terms of like the 80s and all that? Was something that you were really into as a younger kid?
Yes, I was really into this. I do remember seeing this in the theater. Pretty sure I saw it more than once, probably on a birthday party or something like that.
So was that because you wanted to see it, or do you think your parents had a role in that?
I don't remember. Definitely not my parents. Either my brother or kids at school, something like that. It was one of the first fantasy films that I saw. Hawks, wolves, crossbows, swords. What's not to like,
Right. Yeah. I don't remember. I was really trying to think back when I had originally seen this movie, and I don't remember. It had to have been years later, like in my adult life, that I finally saw it. So it was one of these things where, I'm flipping through channels. I missed it. I really just missed the whole thing, to be honest. And maybe in the mid 2000s is probably when I finally saw this. That's my best estimate. And I remember at the time seeing this movie, at least then, I had a slight curiosity with it because I know people talked about it. And we can talk about the book reference real quick, because this is, again, the movie that H is just pounding on Parzival for liking.
Right.
He's basically making fun of it, saying that, that the swords look like they're made out of tinfoil. He talks about the soundtrack being super lame. It's full of synthesizers by the Alan Parsons Project, lame-orama. He says Highlander too lame. And honestly, that was probably, I can't say that I saw it any more than just until the book came out. When the book came out, I saw it again, and I don't know if the book was influencing me or what, but I really had a newfound appreciation for the movie, and especially the Alan Parsons Project, which I've already talked about on one of the shows and was completely dogged by the other hosts, which is fine. Yeah, I don't mind. That's fine. I don't care. They don't know anything anyways. But yeah, I really enjoyed the movie, and so it's kind of a guilty pleasure. I think I've watched it maybe 2 times in the last 2 weeks in preparation for this show, and I really enjoyed both versions of it. Now, I will say this, and this is just kind of a side note. I went and bought the digital version off iTunes because I'm really happy with a lot of the content they put out there and the quality of the content. The version that they have on iTunes is freaking terrible.
Really?
It's not letterbox, and it definitely isn't 4K. I'd be surprised. It looks like someone transferred this off of VHS tape. So Apple, if you listen to this podcast, please go fix that, because it's a really bad version of it. So much that it kind of takes you out of the movie. But if you happen to find a good version, I think it's a really enjoyable movie. He did this movie now. So we're at about 1985. And he kind of released 2 movies, which our final movie, which is going to be Goonies in just a minute. He did release both of these around the same, in that same year. He recorded he directed Ladyhawke prior to doing the Goonies. It was produced by Lauren Schuler, and Lauren Schuler would end up becoming his wife. And there's a cute story where she was constantly trying to send the script to him. He was not in the mood, didn't want to read it. He had been coming off kind of a bad relationship with the Salkind brothers, and or sorry, the father and son duo there. I think he had done Inside Moves temporarily. He did that movie. And then this was his next foray into movies again. But it was kind of a low budget film, at least for the times. And it's a weird story. And I say weird, but it's actually a great story. Because it's about, so the summary is that in medieval times, a youthful pickpocket befriends a strange knight who's on a mysterious quest. This unlikely duo, accompanied by a watchful hawk, are enveloped in a magical adventure. And honestly, based on a lot of the other movies at the time, when you think about like this time period, and I think we talked about this on one of the previous shows, but this is around that time we had like Krull, the Beastmaster, Legend, Willow, Dark Crystal, Dragon Slayer. There was all these fantasy movies that came out, and this was another entry into all of them. And it's very different than a lot of those movies. I want to say this, in my opinion, it's got the best like story, like a fairy tale kind of story. Would you agree?
It has a different story than the rest of them. If I recall correctly, this movie takes place over a matter of days, right? I believe that's correct.
Yeah, it's maybe a little bit longer because they're traveling. They're trying to get there before the eclipse happens.
Right. Okay. So
which I'm kind of spoiling, but
right.
But either way, it's not a long period of time by any means.
No, it's not. And there's not really a whole lot that happens outside of the main storyline. They are on a quest from the very beginning. He's very determined to get to the castle and confront his nemesis there, and that's pretty much exactly what happens. The music in it, though, I don't think it's so far out of place as some of the others. I think like Legend had some digital type synthesizer music in it. Time Bandits had the same type of music in it. I think that this one had, I think, the least bit of camp in it that of any of the movies we're talking about so far. It tries to take itself pretty seriously, except for Matthew Broderick, right?
Yeah.
Who is an interesting cast for the role. It didn't really feel like it was him, but the fact that he was used as comic relief the whole time made a very big difference between that and then his future role in Ferris Bueller.
Right. Yeah. And I guess we kind of skipped over that, but it's got Matthew Broderick as Philippe Gaston. It's got Rutger Hauer as Captain Etienne Navarre. Michelle Pfeiffer plays Isabeau of Anjou. John Wood, who is the Bishop of Acquiesce, or I forget the last, whatever it is now. But yeah, and he would, of course, John Wood and Matthew Broderick would go on to do War Games, or be together at least in War Games, and that's actually referenced in the Ready Player One novel. But and this has got some interesting backstory too, in terms of like some of the people that were originally thought to play some of these characters, like Kurt Russell, Sean Connery, and Dustin Hoffman were all considered for Rutger Hauer's position at one point. I think Kurt Russell actually agreed to do the film, and I forget now why he had to back out of it, and that's when they brought in Rutger Hauer. Schuler at that point wanted Michelle Pfeiffer because she had seen her in Grease 2, and Sean Penn was actually considered for Matthew Broderick's character.
Oh, interesting.
And obviously Broderick got it, and he is kind of the comic relief. And he is it's weird. It's a weird story because it takes place in Europe. It's supposed to take place in Europe. So as best as I can tell, you've got 3 Americans that are just completely lost out in Europe because none of them have accents. I think Broderick tries to do like a British accent, and he falls in and out of it throughout the whole movie, really.
Yes.
So I don't know where he is or whatever, but I always thought it was weird that both, Pfeiffer and Howard but don't really have accents. So yeah, it's weird, like 2 Americans again that are lost, American Werewolf in London kind of thing. But I thought the performances were really good. I thought all 3 of those characters did really well. You got Leo McKern as Father Imperius. I thought he did a really good job. You got a very young Alfred Molina as Caesar the Wolf Trapper. And so this was prior to this, the only other thing that I can remember him in, and don't get me, I'm not discrediting him in any way, but because he's probably done more things, but was Raiders of the Lost Ark.
That's right.
Right? He was that one character who I forget his name now that betrayed him.
Right. It was his buddy.
Yep. But I thought overall the character's really good. And here's the part of the story that I just really liked. I liked the fairy tale aspect of the fact that you've got these two lovers that, because there's a curse placed upon them, at nighttime, the I don't know what's his name. I'm drawing a blank on his name. What's his Captain Etienne Navarre.
Gotcha.
Yeah, nighttime he turns into a wolf, and then when the sun rises, he becomes a man. And Isabeau becomes Ladyhawke, becomes the hawk itself. And so they're kind of in this forever kind of state where they can never be with one another because of changing into these animals. And then, the whole point of this is that it's foretold that there is a moment where there's neither day nor night. And in that moment, they'll be able to kind of have this whole spell kind of curse broken. And that's the kind of the plot line. They're trying to get to, he's trying to get to the castle to kill the archbishop because that's, what he's trying to do is his whole destiny. He's got his sword and there's a whole story behind what he's trying to do with that sword and get the jewel and all that. And then on top of that, they're trying to get to a point where they can break this kind of curse. But I just think that if they really wanted to do, I won't say a sequel, but I think they could really do a remake of this, and I think it could be very successful. I don't know. I'm enamored by the stupid storyline. And maybe I'm the only one.
No, I don't think so. I think an updated version would be pretty cool if it got a fair treatment. A sequel, I think this movie pretty much tells the whole story. I mean, nobody wants to hear about how Philippe became a thief, but hey, maybe that could be fun. Who knows?
So Alan Parsons did the soundtrack. It's very different. At least, again, I think you make a good point. There are a number of other movies where there was a lot of heavy synthesizers. There are other pieces that he did in this that are very just traditionally orchestrated type pieces. So it's a kind of a mixture of both. As the story goes, Richard Donner was really into the Alan Parsons project, or at least Alan Parsons and some of the work that he had done.
Right.
And when they were looking for locations to film for this movie, that's what he was listening to. And so when it came time to actually put music behind it, he thought, well, I've already kind of lived this in my mind. And that's why he sought out Alan Parsons. So I actually enjoyed it. It seems a little repetitive, especially when you watch the movie. It kind of, that same main synthesized track comes up over and over and over again. It just gets drilled into your head. Yeah. But I thought the pieces were fine. I don't really have that big of an issue with them, I guess. Any favorite scenes, quotes, lines, anything like that?
I was a big fan of the transformation scene where they almost get to touch.
Oh yeah, right. At the morning.
Yeah, the visuals get a little kind of strange. You've got the sunlight that's kind of curving around the edges of them, and they've got the eyeballs that are sort of faded in and out between the human eyeballs and the animal eyeballs. But anyway, it was a pretty touching scene, and Felipe's off in the corner crying. That was
right.
That was a pretty cool scene. And of course, the finale was gruesome and fun too.
Yeah, I think the seeing Mouse, right? That's Philippe's nickname, the Mouse. At the very beginning, when he's kind of sitting there and he's approached by the guards, and he ends up going into this like really long 5-minute routine of him escaping the guards in a lot of different ways. I think I thought it was cool as watching it just because okay, I get it now. He's a mouse. You can't catch him. He's
right.
Running away, escaping kind of thing. I thought his conversations with God, he has a lot of these like one-on-one conversations that are with God in different at points were pretty funny. And you almost feel like it's Ferris Bueller. Or maybe I do. It just seems like it's Ferris Bueller talking in those moments. The very ending, it was gruesome in terms of the way the Archbishop dies. But that scene at the very end is like, and again, this is the older me speaking now, because I thought it was kind of sweet and romantic when they finally are able to hold each other, and then he just kind of lifts her up, right? And it's like the light shining on them, the way the whole shot's been framed. Yeah. And it just goes on for a little bit longer than you would expect. It's almost like to the tune of a full minute where they're both happy and, he's holding her up and that kind of thing. It's a really cool precursor to like Dirty Dancing with, Baby being held up in the air. What's that?
I was going to say, this is exactly why I think H said this movie has no balls. Because
no, that's right.
It's a love story, right? It's a love story first and an action film second. Compared to a movie like Willow, where it's kind of the opposite.
Always together, eternally apart.
H never really struck me as the romantic type.
No, not at all. So we talked about whether or not this would make her whether we could redo this movie and whether that'd be successful. And that's, I don't know. There's really not a whole lot more to say here. There's not a whole lot of good background, production notes or trivia. Nothing that we probably already haven't covered. I think overall, I really enjoy this movie, and I've come to like it a lot more than I think when I originally saw it. And if you've never seen the movie, one, go find a good quality version. It's not on Apple, I'll tell you that. And then two, have your loved one next to you when you watch it. All right, so that's enough of that. Any final thoughts on Ladyhawke?
No, let's keep moving on.
All right, so let's end with the Goonies. So the same year, 1985, again, like we mentioned earlier. So just out of the gate, where does this rank in terms of like 80s movies for you? Because for me, it's pretty high. I don't know if I'm going to say it's definitely not number 1 or 2, but as a kid, man, this was a movie that I watched a crap ton of times.
This is one that you could absolutely identify with. It didn't have any superheroes in it. Didn't take place in Europe. This could have happened to you. And that's what was so amazing about this. It's way up there for me. It's right behind Ferris Bueller and Ghostbusters. It's like number 3.
Yeah, it's probably in my top 10. And honestly, this is a movie that when it came out in the theaters, it did well, but it didn't do as well as they were expecting to. I mean, you've got Richard Donner, right, directing it. You've got a script by Chris Columbus. So Chris Columbus was coming right off of Gremlins, which was, obviously huge. And you got Steven Spielberg tied to this as well. So you've got a pretty good powerhouse trio here.
Right.
And I think there was some pretty high expectations of the movie doing really well. And it did do good, but it didn't do as well as expected. Where I remember this movie most, because I never saw this in the theater. What I do remember, though, is this movie was on cable all the time.
Right.
And it's one of the first movies that when it came on cable, we had a VCR ready. We had a VCR at that time, and we recorded it. And once we had that recorded, one summer, this was like the only freaking movie we had, and we watched this over and over and over again. And I think that's where a lot of its popularity came from, was the fact that by this time, VCRs were, becoming more, the home entertainment industry had really kind of started to boom.
That's right.
And this is one of those movies that benefited from that because it was just so readily available to anyone at that point. And I think that's where, again, it got a lot more popular. As a kid, I always wondered what a Goonie was. And for anyone that's still wondering, there's an area, this whole movie is kind of filmed around an area called the Goondocks, which is an area of Astoria, Oregon, which is where the movie takes place. And most of it was shot. So when you hear Goonie, they're talking about somebody that's from the Goondocks. That's where that name comes from. But let's get into the characters. And there's a lot of people here, and we don't necessarily have to go through every one of them. But a lot of these guys have done some really good stuff. Some of them have kind of dropped off the face of the earth. And I don't mean that, some of them have died. So I don't want to be insensitive there. that's not what I meant. I just meant they really didn't do a whole lot with their careers after the Goonies. But, you got Sean Astin as Mikey, who for me is Lord of the Rings and Stranger Things. Anything else that you think?
No, I mean, as far as I know, he didn't do anything between the two of those. When Lord of the Rings came out, it was like, oh, it's the guy from Goonies. Okay.
He did that. He did do another movie. Now I'm drawing a blank on which one it is. There was another movie where he did, I have to come back. Josh Brolin. So Brolin is one of those characters where like he's had this revival, like his whole career is so different now.
Yeah.
Right. Even in the last 5 years or 10 years than it was, the 15, 20 years prior to that.
That's right.
But for me, I've got him down as Sicario because I've enjoyed those two movies. And then of course Thanos, which is, I think he's probably going to go down as being Thanos. That may be his, apart from this, because of, my age and how much of an impact this movie had on me. I think most of I think he's probably going to be remembered for Thanos, especially once we're done with that trilogy.
Now he was in No Country for Old Men, correct?
Yeah,
which was huge,
great performance
at the time, and a great performance.
Yep. Jeff Cohen as Chunk. He didn't do a whole lot. He became a lawyer.
I heard that. I heard he slimmed down and and became a successful businessman.
Yeah, a little unrecognizable now, as skinny as he is, or as much as he's changed over the years. Corey Feldman as Mouth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, Gremlins, Lost Boys, Corey Jackson. Yeah,
Sure.
as the MJ impersonator. I don't know whatever
all that
phase of his life was.
And
Stand By Me.
He's still in the media today.
He is. I feel bad for that guy. I really do. Like, it's just like he had that album that came out. Was it 2-3 years ago? Corey's Angels or something like that.
I didn't hear it. I wasn't going to listen to that.
If you get a chance, go listen to it. I don't know. It's not a great album. It's not even a good album, but he seems like his passion is there. And he really was like, he was out on a tour and he was publicizing it, making the rounds, and it just was not good, dude. So it might be time to hang it up. Carrie Green as Andy. And I don't know. I could not think of anything that she had done, really. She was cute. I had a crush on her.
Who didn't?
Right. Martha Plimpton, as Steph. Yeah. She's done a lot of stuff. Films, TV. What was the movie where they were raising that kid? Or not, it was a TV show. Came out 10 years ago. Anyways, she's done well for herself.
Yeah, she still pops up from time to time.
Yeah. I think she was with River Phoenix too at one point. Jonathan Ke Huy Quan as Data.
Uh-huh.
Fan favorite for me as a kid. The only other thing that I remember him is Short Round.
That's right.
Indy 2. John Matuzak as Sloth.
Uh-huh.
That's a little sad. This guy died. He died in 1989, overdosing on painkillers.
From his football career.
Yeah. He was like the number 1 overall pick at one point. And I don't remember what team he went to, but I didn't know all that until much later in life. I think it was when he died in 89 that I was like, wait, what? He was a football player?
Right.
We could talk about we could put a whole show together about Joey Pantoliano, because he's been in everything.
Joey Pants.
Joey Pants as Francis. I don't know. Matrix stands out for me just because I'm a really big fan of those movies. What about you? Anything?
Yeah, same thing. Matrix.
Anne Ramsey as Mama Fratelli, who I just love in this movie and loved her in was it Planes, Trains, and Automobiles?
Throw Mama from the Train.
Or no, it's Throw Mama from the Train. That's what it was. Yep, sorry. Owen. There was I'm trying to think who are the other people here. We've got Lupe Ontiveros, which is Rosalita. We'll get to her scene a little bit later. Steve Anton is Troy. Steve Anton as Troy was actually Jesse from the Jesse's Girl video.
Oh, really?
At Springfield. Yeah. I did not know that. I got that from doing the research in the show, and honestly, I went back and looked. I'm like, oh yeah, that's him. I do remember him in The Last American Virgin, also, which I saw as a young kid, and I don't know what my parents were thinking. Should not have seen that movie. All right, so that's the cast. Let's just get into the quotes and scenes. What do you got?
The quotes and the scenes. Well, gosh, I mean, everybody knows Goonies Never Say Die. My favorite, Annie, you Goonie.
Right.
I don't know why. That one always just sticks with me.
That's Troy's line.
Yeah, there's so many more. What about you?
Yeah, there's quite a few of them. I think so. All the Sloth lines are pretty good. Baby Ruth, Rocky Road,
This One Time,
Ma, You've Been Bad, and then of course the iconic "Hey, you guys." That's just classic. Going back to that Goonies Never Say Die. Excuse me. That was a pretty good line. It's now Gunter's Never Say Die as far as Ready Player One goes. It's kind of all over the place now. And just recently, even at San Diego Comic-Con, there was a Ready Player One exhibit that you could go to, and they had a whole wall where that was kind of plastered on there that said Gunter's Never Say Die. That tagline was picked up by the San Jose Earthquakes, which is an MLS soccer team. They at one point adopted that as their slogan, which I thought was kind of weird and interesting, and cool all the same. The mouth is scene where he's got the coin. That was like his finest acting moment probably ever. Feldman, right? You know what? This one right here. This was my dream, my wish, and it didn't come true. So I'm taking it back. I'm taking them all back. Great stuff.
It's good.
As a kid, I thought that penis falling off the statue was hilarious.
It was.
Yeah, and the fact that they put it on upside down, that whole bit was, I mean, it still makes me crack up because it reverts me right back to a pubescent kid.
Sure,
again.
and we all knew that one kid that was just a little more inappropriate than the rest of us.
Yeah, right. Chunk's got a lot of great lines too. I like all right, Michael Jackson didn't come over to my house, but his sister did. The Truffle Shuffle is another scene that's everywhere. I mean, I've seen that redone in other movies and other things. The funny thing about that, he was actually reported that he had chickenpox when that scene was filmed, and didn't tell anybody, or he didn't, or his parents didn't. But if you look, and I don't have a version that's good enough. I've got a version on my desk over here, and it's a VHS copy. But apparently, if you got a really high def version of it, you can see that his body is kind of his stomach is full of chickenpox.
That's interesting.
So, not sure if that's true or not. I liked all of Mouth's translations.
That's the best
for Rosalita, right? I mean, even as a kid, I was just like, "What the heck is happening here?" Always separate the drug.
How he's just getting all the stuff off the top of his head.
Right. Yep. I like the Gremlins reference when he calls it into the sheriff department, and the sheriff's working on his his reel for his fishing rod. And he's like, "Oh, sure. Just like that last prank about all those little creatures that multiply when you throw water on them." I thought that was a really cool moment because, Spielberg was involved, and obviously Chris Columbus had wrote the script for that, or wrote the movie for Gremlins. I thought that was a good little Easter egg or throwback there. And I'm trying to think. I mean, just overall, this movie was great because as a kid, it was our own Raiders of the Lost Ark. It was our own, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. They had a great sense of adventure about it. And like you said earlier, this could have been us.
It could have been us.
We were riding bikes and running around, free in this time.
Right.
I would never let my kids go do this now. But yeah, this was a different time, and that sense of adventure was just there. And the practical effects that were used in the movie, there really weren't. Again, another movie where there weren't a whole lot of special effects. Most of them were just practical set type pieces that kind of pulled you into it, I guess.
It certainly feels a lot more real because of that.
Yeah. I thought the chemistry was really good with all of the actors and the kids. They seemed like they were genuinely friends and that they had been together. I really, as a kid, that resonated with me. Like, hey, these, talk and sound like me.
Right.
Let's talk about the soundtrack though. So this was, and this is well, I don't know if we got much more to talk about, but I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about the soundtrack because it's got some pretty memorable pieces in it. The main theme and the ship theme, those kind of things, those come back and used. But the more interesting piece of this was this whole soundtrack with all the pop music that was released
from the day. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So this soundtrack came out. It's out there. It's available if you want to listen to it. Cyndi Lauper was made the musical director for this soundtrack, and she was done at the request of Steven Spielberg. I think Steven Spielberg approached her and said, "Hey, can you be the musical kind of director for the soundtrack?" And she accepted, and so that's why we've got 2 tracks from her. We've got the Good Enough song, Goonies Are Good Enough, and we'll come back to that in a minute. There's another track in there that she contributes to called What a Thrill. And so that line that you mentioned earlier about Andy, you Goonie, that's the song that you hear in the background when they cut to the well up top. You can hear that song. And that song's, it's all right. It's not her greatest. She's done a lot of other great stuff beyond that. But there's one song in here by a group called Goon Squad. And Goon Squad was a group of people that they put together for this movie. And they recorded the song 8 Arms to Hold You. Looking back, I guess, and listening to that song when it was out, I never understood where this came from. And it ties back to a deleted scene in the Goonies where when they go down the slides and they land in the water, originally there was supposed to be an octopus. And if you have like the DVD or the Blu-ray versions of it, I think the scene is actually there. It's not really finished, but it was filmed. And there's supposed to be a underwater octopus, and it's an animatronic octopus. And when you watch it, it's a really bad animatronic octopus, and you understand why they just pulled all of that out. But the funny thing is that song was supposed to be the way they got out. Mouth had his little Walkman with his headset. He actually was playing that song, and he shoves it into the beak of the octopus, and you can hear the music. You can hear this particular song playing, and it dances off, and that's how they get the octopus to let them all go. So,
oh my gosh.
Really corny kind of stuff. But the song Eight Arms to Hold You now makes sense if you listen to that song, because that's where it stemmed from. They have a Philip Bailey. Are you familiar with Philip Bailey?
I don't think so.
So he's got a song on there called Love is Alive. The only other thing that I really remember him in is Easy Lovers with a Phil Collins song. You remember this song?
Yeah.
So the other person singing with Phil Collins on Easy Lover is Philip Bailey.
Philip Bailey, that's right.
And I think he was with Earth, Wind, and Fire at one point too. You got a song from the Bangles called I Got Nothing. And so at this point, the Bangles really weren't popular at all. But Cyndi Lauper was a huge fan of them. And so she really pushed to get them on there. And this probably didn't, launch their career. They probably did that on their own, but it was, an early track from a band that would go on to do some pretty big things. Tina Marie contributes a song called 14K. It's kind of a sad story. She was laying in bed one night and a painting fell off the wall, hit her in the head, and then she suffered seizures from that point on. This is in 2004. And then in 2010, she died just in her sleep. And they think it's tied back to the fact that painting fell off the wall. So I don't know why I shared that. That's kind of morbid. But REO Speedwagon. So they've got a song on here called Where You're Going, It's All Right. And I don't know this song at all. Like, I listened to it and I've heard it a few times more recently, but it really doesn't stand out. Do you have a favorite REO Speedwagon song?
A Roll of the Changes.
Yeah, that's my favorite. But, Keep On Loving You.
Heard it from a friend.
Can't Fight This Feeling. Yeah, they've got the hits.
Yep.
In fact, I think that's what the greatest hits is called. The hits, Rolling with the Hits. I don't know, something like that. There's Luther Vandross. We talked about Cyndi Lauper's song. But one of the songs that I thought you'd find interesting is there's a song on there called Save the Night by Joseph Williams. Now, Joseph Williams would actually become the lead singer for a band called Toto.
Huh.
Were you aware of this?
I was not.
Are you aware of the band Toto?
I know the band Toto relatively well.
So, and I know this is like it's one of my favorites, but I know it's really one of your favorites. So he was the lead singer for Toto from 1985 to 1988. He was on the Fahrenheit and the Seventh One albums when they were released. But that's not where this interesting story ends. So he did that. Prior to this, he had done a song on in Return of the Jedi. I told you guys we were going to talk about a lot of Star Wars here, but in Return of the Jedi, there is a song called Lapti Nek. And for those of you that have been longtime fans of that, this is the song that's playing in Jabba's Palace. He actually wrote the lyrics to that. Now, that song is not in English. It's in another language. It's probably in Huttese, I think, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong there, but it's in another language. But he wrote the lyrics to that song. Huh. And then to come to find out, and I don't know why I didn't know this, he's actually the son of John Williams. So the composer, John Williams. So
that's right.
His son.
That's right.
Yeah.
I can remember reading that several years back, and it just slipped my mind for this podcast.
And so we started by talking about the Goonies Are Good Enough. Did you watch the music video for this?
Oh, yeah.
For this song?
I mean, I watched something that called itself a music video.
It's
crazy.
I love the song. Love the song. Absolutely love the song. It's a terrible video. It's so corny. And I remember when this came out, the MTV did a thing where they, because it's two parts. It's nearly 13 minutes long. It's like this epic kind of video. It was shot and it was filmed and directed by Richard Donner. It's got Steven Spielberg in it. It has David Wolf, who's Cyndi Lauper's manager. The cast of the Goonies, for the most part, except like Cary Green and some of the older folks, they weren't in it, but most of the kids are in this video. The Bangles are in the video as well. They come out in part 2, and they're kind of dressed. I think one of them is dressed as a lady that's fighting behind the sushi bar. And trust me, I'm not making any of this up. And then the other ones are kind of dressed as pirates. But the weirdest thing is the fact that they've got all these WWF wrestlers.
Tons of them.
Tons of them, right? And and we talked about this, I think, a little bit on this. Just some of this you've probably already heard if you're a regular listener to the show. But yeah, this is at the height of the WWF era. We had the cartoon out. It was huge in the weekends. Not to the tune of where it's at today, but this was an icon in American pop culture at the time. So you had like Captain Lou Albano in here, and this was in his first video. He actually was the father in Girls Just Want to Have Fun music video for Cyndi Lauper. So this is his second return.
Exactly. She's had a fascination with these wrestlers for quite some time.
Yeah. I mean, Roddy Piper,
The Iron
The
Sheik.
Iron Sheik. Yep. You've got Nikolai Volkov, who's milking a cow in the back of a truck. What? I don't even know what to say. You've got Andre the Giant. And he's not in the first part. He comes back. He comes in part 2 after like Cyndi Lauper like whistles him to come in for like backup. And then he just starts, beating everybody down and kind of saves the day. And that's kind of how the video ends.
Pretty sure Ric Flair's in there.
The Nature Boy. I don't know if he's in there or not. I think it was the Fabulous. Well, I don't remember who that was now. I'm trying to think. Fabulous Moolah? I don't know. But yeah, it was the video. If you haven't had a chance, do yourself a favor and go watch this one. Totally worth it to watch part 1 and part 2. Now remember, there is a part 2, and it's a kind of to be concluded kind of thing, but it's super corny. It follows kind of a very loose line, a storyline of the Goonies. Right. But yeah, it's certainly worth watching. And then maybe we can just end here before we kind of wrap it up. The Goonies game that came out for the NES. Were you? I don't know if we've ever had this conversation. Were you into NES games younger?
No, I missed the whole NES era. I think I was out of video games at that time, and then didn't get back in them until after that was a thing.
And there was a game that was released for the Nintendo Entertainment System. This is the 8-bit NES system, and it was called Goonies 2. And I remember as a kid, again, this is mid 80s or so, thinking that this was a game based on the movie sequel, and I wasn't the only one. Years later, I would go on to work at a video game store where we sold used video games for a few years, and this was always a question that came up. Hey, what is this based on the sequel movie? No, dude, the movie there was never a sequel. Oh, where's part 1? Oh, well, that game never came out either. And the reason why was because this game was originally released in Japan on a system that never made it out to the U.S. as Goonies 1. And then when they finally brought it over to America, they released the second version of that video game, which was not based on the movie. And so it's just a huge amount of confusion in terms of why it was ever called Goonies 2. But that's, a little backstory in terms of why. But yeah, in terms of, I guess, the Goonies, the only other thing that I had on here was whether or not we'd ever get a sequel. Because as long as I can remember, they've been talking about doing a sequel to this movie, and nothing has ever manifested. Have you heard about this stuff? Have you kept up on it?
I have. It seems like every 4 or 5 years I hear rumors about the sequel, or I'll go look up something about it, and you have a cast reunion picture, and it's like, yeah, well, they're talking it over. And personally, I don't think this should ever happen. It can't work. But I do believe that the original will be remade, and it will be terrible. But I mean, how could it not? This is a nostalgic gem. It's both a masterpiece, and it's not a really great movie either. I mean, some of the acting is pretty bad. This is one of those that, for me, the nostalgia really carries this movie for me. And watching it now, even with my kids, it's a little tough. You just got to go with it and laugh.
Booby traps.
Booby traps.
That's what I said. Booby traps. Yeah, we skipped over that line. Yeah, it comes up, like you said, every once in a while. I think the latest one that I recall was that they would all be adults and they would have their own kids, and it's their kids that would go on this Goonie adventure, and somehow they would be pulled in or rescue the kids at the very end, that kind of thing. And all that's just I don't know if it really would have made it for good. I think it's too late now.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's it's kind of like landing on the moon. You've got a very small frame window here to really kind of pull it off, and I think that's already passed. So as much as I longed for a sequel for this movie over the years, yeah, I'm with you there. I don't know that it really makes sense at this point, and I don't know. Maybe the sequel or the remade version of it would suck, but that's probably going to be their best approach if they want to probably capitalize on the franchise, or at least the what's the word I'm looking for? The intellectual property, the IP. Yeah. Sorry, thank you. Final answer. All right. I think we'll end the Goonies there. I guess just overall, any final thoughts on Richard Donner, at least this set of movies? Because I mean, he went on to do, he's so got the toy, more. Right? Lethal Weapon, that whole series, The Lost Boys. He was involved in that. He's made most of his money, to be honest, from all of the X-Men movies. He's tied to all of those as a producer. And for the most part, even I think X-Men Wolverine, the Origins Wolverine movie. But there's definitely a case to be made that he did change again, going back to the Superman and those movies and the way they're made. I think he was really kind of pushing for what they call straight now versus camp,
Right.
In the industry. But I guess overall, any kind of final thoughts on Richard Donner and his contributions with these 4 movies?
He's a guy that you don't hear all the time in the same words as George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, but he's absolutely right up there with him. And if you're a fan of any of these movies, you've definitely heard his name.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the string of movies that you read off, plus I'm sure handfuls of others, he's made a huge impact. And it's great to see what folks that are continuing to make these superhero movies have taken from how he's changed it from very campy into more of a straight kind of film. You see that in almost all the X-Men movies, as well as the newer Superman movies. You see this more in the Wonder Woman movie, those types of things. He's made a huge impact, and maybe we'll get some more from him.
Yeah, definitely one of my favorite directors growing up as a kid, just because of these movies and so many more. And I'm always looking forward to what he's doing. If his name is tied to a movie, it certainly piques my interest enough that I'm going to probably take a look at it and follow him. So with that, I think we'll end this show. I've probably let people wait long enough, but the song I was trying to remember was Average White Band's "Pick Up the Pieces." That's the name of the song that's in the diner. So it's got this little jazzy tune to it. That was the name of the song.
I'm so glad we circled back around for that.
Hey, I wasn't going to let it go. I told you I'd come back to it and let you know. That's it. Go take a listen to that song if you're in a jazz kind of mood. So if you'd like to follow us, you can do so on all the links that are provided in the show notes. Definitely would appreciate it. The next show that we've got coming up is part 1 of chapter 6. We've broken this up into 6 pieces really in total. And the reason why is because this is the chapter that I've been dreading. And I say that in a very loving way, but there's just so many pop culture references that are thrown there. But we're going to be talking all kinds of things. We'll be talking Star Trek, the original series. We're going to get into Real Genius. We'll talk about James Cameron, Steven Spielberg. For music, we have The Police, Bon Jovi. So we'll be talking about hair bands. And then we're going to anchor all of this with the Transformers. And we are having Stargate Pioneer, SP, is back joining me for that show. And we've got a special guest who's Jeremy Dennis of the Transmissions podcast, which is a Transformers only. It's kind of solely focused on Transformers. So we're going to anchor the show on that, and we'll really get into some really hot topics and when it comes to Transformers. So it's going to be a great show. And then from there, again, we've got another 5 episodes that we've broken out, and we'll be bringing in a lot of the other co-hosts. Maybe Bill, we'll wait and see. But we've got a lot of the co-hosts that have been on the show already who will be helping out to kind of tackle chapter 6. So with that, we'll end the show, and we will see you guys in 2 weeks. The views and opinions of the Basement Hosts are of our own and are not in any way affiliated with Random House or Ernest Klein. All quotes, music, sounds, trademarked, and copyrighted material referenced in the show are owned by the respectful companies and creators and are used by the Basement as fair use for entertainment purposes only. It would take me a month to read this whole disclaimer, but sad to say, I don't have that kind of time.